Hey, everybody, welcome, welcome, welcome to the Santita Jackson Show. Harry, Carol Saskin, my sister from another mister out there in the hills of Beverly. Laura Bell, how you doing, sweetie? Ashley down there in Memphis. Sending you all so much love, everybody. Please like and share the show and tell everybody about AM 950 Radio, the voice of progressive Minnesota. I am Santita Jackson. We've got a lot to talk about on the 61st anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Indeed, it was a march that was more than 20 years in the making. And we remember it for Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. But did you listen to the whole speech? It really was a dressing down of the American government. He didn't come there dreaming. He came there telling America, you have bounced your check on me, and I've come here to collect. And they pushed him to the end of the march because he was so popular. But there were, of course, all of these battles within the movement. And they thought that by keeping him at the end of the march, that the crowd would have diminished and no one would have heard him. But the quarter of a million people were waiting to hear him. You never know how the Lord's going to work it out. And now that is what we remember from that march. But John Lewis was going to deliver a stinging rebuke of our government. And so there's a lot of furious back and forth that occurred in which but March leaders were asking him to just calm his language down a bit because they were already going back and forth with John F. Kennedy. They shut the city of Washington, D.C. down because they were afraid that this gathering would destroy the city. They thought it would be violent, even though the people who were calling for the march were nonviolent. And they were calling for jobs and freedom. And yes, just a couple of weeks later, the four little girls were killed in retaliation for that march, for that unified front that blacks and whites and indigenous people and Latinos and Asian people and Jews and Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and agnostics and atheists came together just to create a more perfect union. And of course, that was on the anniversary of the murder of Emmett Till. And just that morning, they had found out that W.E.B. Du Bois had died in Accra, Ghana. All of that history came together in that moment. So where are we today? 60 years later, the Institute for Policy Studies has a study, and one of the authors of that study will be with us in the next hour to talk about the fact that now Black people have really been here since the Spaniards got here. Maybe in 1532, that is one of the estimates. Many of us look at 1619, okay, so we can stay there, but we've been here since the early 1500s. That after all of this time, after more than 400 years, but after between 400 and 500 years, it will take us 500 more years from today to reach economic equality, that is Black people. How can that be? Got to talk about that, everybody, on the Santita Jackson Show. Please go to the Santita Jackson Show YouTube channel. Everybody, please like and subscribe. Hey, Mike. All right, you all. Robert, how you doing? Shalom, my dear brother. Please like and subscribe, and please share the show. Please share the show. And let's talk about this. Go to X at Santita J and join me there and just continue to spread news about the show. But let's have a discussion on this 61st anniversary of the March on Washington for jobs and freedom. Do we have that now? Where are we today? You know, they say when Black folks white folks catch cold, Black folks catch pneumonia. But it just means that at the end of the day, there's a sickness here. And if you don't care for those who are the most vulnerable, the damned, the despised, that hurricane is coming your way if you keep on living. So let's talk about this. And let's look at all of the forces that laid aside so many internecine battles, Ariel Gold, and they reconciled. They put so much aside just to come together. When you look at when you look at the people who were there, they just came together and they really made their mark in history. And how can we continue to carry this 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 movement forward. Mark Fancher, National Conference of Lawyers, Reverend Dr. Jeanette Wilson from Rainbow Push, and Ariel Gold, Fellowship of Reconciliation. Let's start with you, Dr. David Gibbs. You're an historian. If you would give us really the 30,000-foot view, because many people don't know that this was a march that the Kennedy administration was dreading. They were afraid of it, quite frankly. And they shut the, and, Ariel Gold. I think when you read all of this stuff, you say, wow, look at this. But it was really a loving coming together, and what an event it was. But in real time, it wasn't received that way. And then, indeed, a couple of weeks later, these four babies were killed in that church, with a fifth nearly dying, nearly being killed in that explosion from those white supremacists. Dr. Gibbs.
Yeah, I'd like to, if you don't mind, start with the larger issue of the racial wage gap and
Mm-hmm.
racial sort of income and wealth gap, and then start with that, and then move to the March on Washington and its historical significance. We do have this enormous problem in this country of a racial wage, income, and wealth gap with immense gap between the living standards of people of color in general, especially African Americans, also American Indians, and the larger population. It has, in fact, grown in recent decades by some estimates, and we can wait 500 years, I suppose, to correct it if we want to do nothing about it. So I think there are two questions. One is, where did this come from, and what can we do about it? In terms of the first question, one part, of course, is straightforward. We have this thing in this country called the legacy of slavery, going back possibly to 1619, maybe even earlier, depending upon what you want to look at, as well as the circumstances in which the slaves were freed, the very, very, really very negative circumstances under which that happened. We know this. This is a well-known story. And that is no doubt one of the main sources of the racial wage gap today. But there's something else that I think receives less attention, that should receive more attention, in my view, which is Milton Friedman, the coming of free market economics. If you look at the data on the racial wage gap from the time of, let us say, the New Deal in the 30s and 40s into the 70s, it was actually declining very substantially. The New Deal and the sort of extended New Deal, the series of policies of labor unions, at least a moderate welfare state, progressive taxation. This was not only good for working people, it was actually even better for Black people, and that there was enormous narrowing of the racial wage gap, which continued decade after decade after decade. And it was going down, down, down through the 70s. And, by the 70s, some people were looking at it and saying, if this goes on for another maybe 20 or 30 years, it'll disappear completely. We won't have a racial wage gap anymore. That's the way things were moving. And then it stopped in 1980, just stopped. And it remained flat and then began to increase after 1990. All right, and here we are today. And what happened in 1980? Well, you don't have to look very hard to see this was the coming of free market economics. Some people would say it was the coming of Ronald Reagan, but I think that's too simple. It was both parties that did it. It would be giving Reagan too much credit, if you will, to put it all on him. It was indeed a bipartisan shift that really tremendously lowered living standards for working people in general, and especially had a negative effect on the African American community. And so I think that's an important element that needs to be taken into account. And it does point to a potential solution. Obviously, we can't, with the snap of a finger, undo hundreds of years of American history. That can't be done. But what we can do is, have a revival of redistributionist policies of a sort we had up to the 70s. That can be done. And I think the way it could be done politically is the kind of thing that was being advocated 61 years ago, which is, Martin Luther King was advocating not only racial justice, he was advocating that for sure, but also economic justice. And he wanted a multiracial coalition that was to some extent going to be working class in character to carry forth this objective. That was part of his vision. That was part of what he was marching for in 1963. And, I think the legacy of that being sort of buried historically, that whole idea of a multiracial working class coalition. The fact that we don't really have that today, and we're not close to having that today. One of the effects of that is the racial age gap and the increase in this problem, and the fact that there really seems to be no immediate prospect for changing that through existing policies. I think basically there really is something to be learned from what happened 61 years ago in terms of addressing the racial wage gap today.
But you're also looking at the uni party, which is something people don't want to talk about today. I mean, and even as we're going, Ariel Gold and Reverend Dr. Jeanette Wilson and Mark Fancher into this election that could prove to be that is already historic because you have a black Southeast Asian woman heading the ticket, right? Uh, but in the meantime, you got inequality that is growing in the United States of America. You have affirmative action that has been wiped out in higher education. You have DEI that's being pushed down. And in your book, that I encourage everyone to get, The Revolt of the Rich, really, this is what we've seen. We saw after those massive societal changes, because along with those economic changes, I had my grandfathers who came back from the Second World War who said, now, wait a minute, there was a fight for us to even go to this war. Now, I'm not going to have the same America. I'm not going to live in the same America that I left. I'm not going to free Europeans and come back here and live under subjugation. I'm not going to do it. So, with all of that, there were massive economic and societal changes um, that helped everybody. But now look at us. And I think you're right. It's an oversimplification to make it just about Reagan. It was only Reagan. But, I think it's so much easier for us to like pin the tail on the donkey, if you will, instead of looking at something that you just mentioned. Both parties, both parties who speak for the oligarchs, they just give different cultural messages. They came together and really undermined America and really undid the social contract in many respects.
That's right.
Dr. Gibbs. I mean, so what's the way forward? I mean, because you've got this legacy. Um, the Institute for Policy Studies says, it's still a dream. Jobs and freedom, equality coming together. What's the path forward as you see it?
I was very, in terms of, recent, you know, um, advocacy of the kind of position I'm taking. The Bernie Sanders campaign, I think more in 2016 than 2020, did very much have this kind of message of a fundamental redistribution away from the rich. What we're having is redistribution in favor of the rich. That's what we've been having since the late 70s. And so he wanted to reverse that. He wanted policies that were dedicated to reversing that process away from the rich. And, I would note that would not only help people in the middle and lower classes, but, since we're talking specifically about the racial wage gap, there's a lot of evidence that would help correct the racial wage gap and put it on the road to basically eliminating eventually the racial wage gap. I think the Biden Harris presidency have taken what I would call baby steps in that direction, but these are only baby steps. And they've been counteracted to some extent by the foreign policy actions they've been taking, which have been increasing U.S. spending on overseas adventures, all right, raising prices through things like sanctions, particularly on food and energy, that are counteracted some of the positive things he's done domestically. And so, it's going to take a lot more than what Biden and Harris have done in the last 4 years to correct this problem. It's going to take much more dramatic efforts. It is going to require a substantial majority in Congress, both houses of Congress, to make this happen. Having this sort of knife edge, politics at a knife edge, where the parties are evenly balanced, where it's very difficult to get legislation through Congress. That's not going to make any of this possible. But in principle, it can be done because a majority of people in the country would benefit from changing the distribution of wealth and income in this country. Again, I think that was very much the vision that Martin Luther King had in 1963, and clearly also at the time of his assassination in 1968.
And Bayard Rustin and James Farmer and Roy Wilkins and A. Philip Randolph, Rabbi Heschel, Charlton Heston, who led the delegation coming from Hollywood. I mean, no, the facts are what they are now. They are what they are. And, he is famous for his conservative politics, if one wants to call that, in his later life. But he was someone who actually had an interracial love story, which is something that white men did not do at that time, at the height of his fame. And he did lead uh, Marlon Brando and Diane Carroll and James Garner and Sidney Poitier, of course, and Harry Belafonte helped to lead that contingent. But they needed white cooperation. And I think it's important for us to mention that. You know, that there were a lot of people who came together, and it was the most unusual kind of group who were coming together under that banner at the Lincoln Memorial. Ariel Gold, you've been shaking your head vigorously in assent because it seems like this march was tailor made for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. As you looked at the broader, I mean, I saw nuns in their entire habits. Then you saw members of the Greek, leaders of the Greek Orthodox Church, rabbis, people who really came complete in their regalia so that they could be identified and that they could be identified with the least of these on that day. What are your impressions? What is your takeaway 61 years later and as we're moving into the future?
Well, I've been thinking a couple things. As you were just talking about the march, I was thinking this is why we embrace nonviolence, because through nonviolence, as we engage in our struggles to overcome various forms of oppression, we are at the same time building our civil society, building the community and the world that we want to live in. And that's one of the qualities of nonviolent resistance. And the other thing that I was really thinking about is, the as we achieve our goals towards equality, the empire reconstitutes itself, right? So after slavery, the empire, created the police force from the slave trackers and Jim Crow. And as we overcame Jim Crow, white nationalists relied on old Jewish conspiracy theory to say there was a cabal, an evil cabal of Jews orchestrated the civil rights movement. And then we see, that same empire continue to reconstitute itself in forms of economic racism and oppression. And so our work is never done, right? We have to appreciate the gains as we achieve them, and at the same time know that this is the arc of justice continues to the arc of the universe continues to bend towards justice, but only if we are continuously pulling it down. And so we have to see what we've accomplished and where we've come, and keep going. These right now we live under systems of capitalism and neoliberalism that are as oppressive as previous systems of the U.S. empire. And we keep taking steps forward, and I fully agree that the Biden administration took some baby steps, probably outdone by the massacres and wars that the Biden administration has gotten into. But there have been some baby steps towards redistribution of wealth, and we have to keep that going. We have to build on the successes that we have had in that, and keep going.
Because it's not going to work unless we do. I mean, because we've seen the inequality grow. Attorney Mark Fancher, your thoughts 61 years ago, 61 years later, in whichever direction you choose to take it.
Well, the that march really represented one phase of Dr. King's development. And it was representative of where the civil rights movement was at that time. And it was a well-intended movement. It was a movement that was carried out by incredibly courageous people. But at the same time, they made some significant miscalculations. And I think that Dr. King became very much aware of those as his life moved forward over the next 5 to 6 to 7 years. Because at the time of his death, he was in an entirely different kind of a place. Uh, what was not recognized, and what I think to a large degree is still not recognized by many, is that the United States of America rests on a paradigm that nobody has really questioned in a serious way, and in a way that would be necessary to eliminate these kinds of projections that we're talking about, where it will take 500 years to achieve some type of economic parity across racial lines. And the basic idea of America is that there are people who own stuff, and there are people who serve these people who own stuff. Sometimes these people who serve are paid minimal wages. They're exploited, they're moved around as necessary, and sometimes they're rejected and marginalized. And then there are other people who serve who don't get paid anything, and they're brutalized, and they're otherwise treated as enslaved people until there is enough pressure put on the people who own stuff to finally let them enjoy some measure of compensation for what they do, some types of rights. But at the same time, this fundamental paradigm, this idea that there are people who own stuff and other people who serve them, is one that has never been really, really seriously challenged on a sustained basis. To the extent that there has been some reduction in the disparities that we've seen economically, it has been in periods when there has been a desire or a drive or a movement to try and change that paradigm. When you had the international workers of the world, one of the first big unions, powerful unions, the Wobblies, as they were called, were not limited in their vision to the idea of just trying to get better working conditions and higher wages for workers. They wanted to seize the means of production. They wanted to take things away from the owners and eliminate that as an idea, to put the power and the wealth and the materials in the hands of the workers. But somehow that movement was hijacked, it was destroyed. And so the union movement, organized labor became more focused on maintaining the paradigm that we have, where there are people who own stuff, and those of us who are workers just go to them basically with hat in hand saying, please give us something more. And if you don't, we'll act up, we'll stop working, we'll do these kinds of things. We make threats that only impact them in a minimal kind of a way. And they never really fear that they're going to have their power taken away from them. So that has been the problem. At the time of the March on Washington, that was the idea, jobs. They weren't going there looking for ownership. They weren't going there to seize the means of production. It was with the idea that we're going there and we're going to prevail upon the goodwill and the good nature of those who own things to give us more work, to give us employment, and to give us more rights. That was the idea. By the time, as David Gibbs mentioned, by the time Dr. King was killed, he had a different program altogether. He was talking about an economic bill of rights, which was a guarantee of power and rights and economic power for the poorest, the most marginalized, the most damned and despised, that there was an expectation that they would have everything that they need, that this country with its resources would redirect all of its resources away from war in Southeast Asia and redirect them to providing for the basic, most fundamental needs of everybody, to make sure that everybody was fed. And that was an idea that got him killed. And I think pretty much anybody who has advocated in a serious way taking power away from those who have power and redistributing it in a real way, basically eliminating the capitalist order, the capitalist system, those are people who face persecution. Those are people who face potential death. And I think that to take it a step further, I think that the political system that exists in this country has been fixed in a way that anybody who wanted to pursue those kinds of objectives would not have the opportunity to seriously pursue them through the electoral process and through the political process that we have. You cannot do it that way. The only way that it's going to really happen is through revolution, however one might define that. The system that we know the system that we participate in will have to be destroyed. And so that does not mean that we all pick up rifles and that we retreat to the bush and wage guerrilla warfare, or that we engage in urban warfare or that kind of thing. But there are things that we can and should look at as strategies for finally bringing down the empire, because it must fall. It's destroying itself. And I think that in order to do that, we have to look beyond the borders of the United States. We have this tendency to confine ourselves to the United States as the arena in which we fight. And that is incredibly limiting, because our strongest and our best allies are beyond the borders. There are so many things happening in other parts of the world where people have targeted the very forces that keep working people and poor people and oppressed people and people of color down in this country. And we have not built effective alliances with them so that we can work on a global level to attack a global empire. You know, we've made passing reference in the past to the fact that Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger have, just through the unity of those three African countries in the Sahel region, have been able to stand up against the empire, France and the United States, and to chase them out of their territory. We don't talk about the power of the people in Venezuela, who, despite the propaganda campaign that was waged against Maduro, in spite of everything that was done to try and remove him, stood up and voted him back into office anyway. We don't talk about what's happening in Haiti, where these people who are derisively labeled as gangs are groups of people whose stated objective is to reverse the order, to change what's happening and what has been happening in Haiti in terms of the abuse of the people there, and to wage a revolution that dislodges an elite group that controls that country. All over the world, you see this resistance. And we have not really effectively tapped into it and had a frank conversation about how we globally strategize in a way that will not only eliminate the threat of the empire to the oppressed people of the world elsewhere, but to affect the conditions of poor people and oppressed people in this country. And that is a step that we need to do. So much time, so much energy is spent on looking at the Democratic Party. I mean, you know, I know we've got to go through the motions to do that, but ultimately, if our emotional and political energy is expended in thinking that that is the route to liberation, it is an incredible waste. And we have to move beyond it. Certainly, Dr. King did. He was not confined to that. Otherwise, he would have run for office himself. He would have been more involved and engaged in that process. He was smart enough back in the 1960s to know that if he was going to achieve liberation for people, that it was going to have to be through extraordinary means.
No question about that. Dr. Gibbs, I know you have to leave us shortly. Uh, what is your final thought before you do go?
Well, you know, I wanted to echo what Mark Fancher said about, um, eh, we're putting too much emphasis, I think, upon always the next election. In this particular case, you know, vilifying Trump. But Trump's not a nice person, but I think that more effort should be made to sort of try and mobilize people, especially working class people who are supporting Trump, and convincing them that they're making a mistake by backing the wrong person here. And he's not the solution to their problems, and trying to, rather than vilify his supporters, make common cause with his supporters. Because that's how you build a coalition. That's how you build a large working class coalition. And I think basically that's how you get things done in this country. A large multiracial coalition is what's necessary here. And I think I'm disturbed to hear a lot of my leftist friends also not only just vilifying Donald Trump, but the people who vote for him. That's a mistake, I think. I've always thought that's a big mistake. And what you do is you persuade them to move away from Trump. That's what needs to be done here. And generally speaking, the focus upon always the next election and the existing political parties has really become something of a crutch and an impediment to serious discussion about what needs to be done in this country. Thank you for having me, Santita, and have a nice day, everybody. Bye-bye.
And everybody, if you want more of that, get his book, The Revolt of the Rich, because it really does come down to that, because the rich are in both parties. and the rich really are in a massive hug behind the scenes. They really, really are. And we need to pay attention to that because somehow or another they continue to win. I think they've increased their wealth over the pandemic by $1.5 trillion. And yet we're poorer. Think about that, everybody. Dr. David Gibbs, The Revolt of the Revolt of the Rich. Get that book, everybody.
Thanks again, Santita. Bye.
Absolutely. Reverend Dr. Jeanette Wilson, what say you on this 61st anniversary? And particularly given the fact that you are an educator, you have to talk to children and young people. And that's nothing to be underestimated because, we will hear them say rather ruefully that we've not made any progress. They have no idea that these people had come together, Ariel and Mark Fancher and Reverend Dr. Hatch and Dr. LaShawn Latrice. They were marching in a segregated city. A black woman could not try on a hat or clothes at the Garfinkel's store, which was the most high-end store in Washington, please, through my college years. It was like Neiman Marcus and I Magnin and Bonwit Teller and all these other fabulous places all rolled up into one. Oh no, I don't care. I don't care if you were Mrs. Thurgood Marshall, whose husband was not even Deputy Solicitor General yet. But I don't care who you were. You could not go in there and try on a hat. That's the city that they marched on. Reverend Dr. Wilson.
Well, thank you, Santita. I was beginning to be a teenager when the March on Washington occurred. An interesting thing about the season that we lived in at that time, the unemployment rate didn't really account for Black people because many of us were working in low wage positions as waiters and people who work in day labor for whatever they could get. And in the South, they were still picking cotton and chopping cotton for $5 a week, Hatch. And
working on the chain gang on the weekends.
Yeah, and so it was a very different time. I did a quick research on the movies that were shown during that time. Reagan played in a film called Killers, where he played for the first time a bad guy, a mob boss. And you had the Flintstones, the Beverly Hillbillies, My Three Sons, Perry Mason, Jimmy Dean Show, and then you had Liz Taylor play Cleopatra. So now, I mean, and she made a lot of money.
She was the highest paid actress in the world. She made $1 million.
Yes, and then To Kill a Mockingbird was the first time they even showed a movie that depicted the racial tensions that existed at that time. Mm-hmm. And the segregation was so pervasive in major cities like Chicago and New York. Chicago, we could not live south of 63rd Street. Couldn't move west of Halsted. You couldn't go north of Madison. And so that's why we were concentrated in pockets. We could not go to what is now Bridgeport. And when I hear young people moving to Bridgeport, you remember Dr. King marched in Bridgeport before he died. You couldn't go to Canaryville, and it wasn't like they were rich people, but they worked in the city.
Well, wait a minute, Reverend Wilson, point out the fact that every mayor that we knew until I went to college was from Bridgeport, Ariel Gold.
Absolutely.
And in the late 70s, early 80s, my mother picked my friends and I up from school one day, and I was a member of the Chicago Children's Choir. And she was taking Thalia Keys and several of us to the rehearsal because we needed to be there like very, very quickly after school. And our commute was like an hour. We needed to be there like within 30 minutes. And she took a wrong turn because she wasn't really familiar with that part of the city because my high school was just beyond Bridgeport.
Right.
And when we saw Welcome to Bridgeport, all of the kids in the car, we ducked. And my mother said, reassuringly, Reverend Hatch, don't worry, we'll be out of here in a minute. I mean, because Ariel, it was going into Bridgeport was
sudden death.
Sudden death. You were going to get killed, and that's where the mayors lived.
Yes. And
through up until Harold Washington, every mayor was
we
from
never had to go to school and they say, "Who's your mayor?" I always knew who it was because it was daily, daily.
And then Belandic, and then Byrne, and then Daley.
And then, so you had segregated housing. You couldn't buy property in like where Push is sitting now. There was a restrictive covenant, Mark Fancher, running on the land. There was a vacant lot. I should never forget it. And you could not buy the vacant lot because it had a restrictive covenant.
Wait, the neighborhood I grew up in.
Restrictive covenant.
The Hall of Famer, Gale Sayers, many of you would remember him from the Chicago Bears.
Yes.
If you read his memoir, I Am Third, he talks about the fact that George Halas, who owned the Bears, bought him a house. Because he couldn't buy the house himself.
Until Reverend Jackson came up with the mortgage. People were buying houses on contract, and there were houses, and Reverend Hatch knows this, on the west side. They kept selling the house 15 different times. You miss a payment, they sold the house, you got put out, and they sell it to somebody else on contract, and your contract meant absolutely nothing. So the reason we have a low wealth, the empire that Mark, you talk about, the empire controlled your housing, it controlled your education, the quality of education, and how far you could go. It controlled your rights of citizenship. It controlled your employment. I remember you could not teach and be certified as a teacher beyond 63 all the way to the 70s before these teachers were grandfathered in, where they were certified as teachers. And so when you think about empire, it has to control every aspect of your life, which includes your movement in and out of community, your right to acquire property. You couldn't get a bank loan, a mortgage to buy property or to invest in business. So when you say, well, we don't have any Black businesses, they couldn't get money to start a business. We had 6 Black banks at one time. We have no Black banks in Chicago right now.
Unbelievable.
I mean, that's just amazing to me, because had it not been for those banks, we would not have been able to have thriving Black businesses like Taylor Wright Cleaners. We had people manufacturing orange juice, Joe Louis milk. How does a boxer, as powerful as he was, die broke as a doorman in Las Vegas? And that's because the empire controls all of these things. And at least we knew we were being discriminated against in 1963. I'm not clear that some Blacks who have matriculated from college and have these jobs really understand that you're still the N-word at the end of the day. Dr. King was the prophetic voice that at that time no one wanted to hear the truth that he was preaching. He wasn't popular when he was killed.
And he wasn't popular with many at that march.
He wasn't on the schedule to speak.
Well, they put him at the end. That's why he brought Mahalia Jackson, who's the most popular spiritual singer in the world.
They put him.
Wait a minute, and that's why C.L. Franklin had the march on Detroit in June.
Absolutely.
He said, Martin, we're going to force their hand, because C.L. Franklin was the biggest Black preacher in America.
Absolutely.
And they marched hundreds of thousands of people on Detroit, and Mahalia Jackson was there. And you heard the beginnings of the I Have a Dream speech, which is why she started shouting at him, exhorting him, Martin, tell him about the dream. She was pushing him at the end of his speech, and that's when he went extemporaneous.
And I think that the greatest movement for liberation, and I really don't want to say this, Dr. Hatch, I know you're going to be next, really came from the West Side, because they recognized the greatest oppression. People that moved far south thought, well, we can buy a house now, even though we're paying twice as much for the mortgage than we should. Us got us a little house that we can't even maintain because we don't have enough income coming into our homes. we got us a little grocery store that's a mom and pop grocery store that can't. It's not a supermarket because we only had one supermarket in the history of Chicago. And so I say that it was a great dream that Dr. King painted this picture of what we should be fighting for when we stop fighting as a people. And now we think that we're there and we're not.
No, we're not. No, we're not.
It's not about who you vote for, it's how do you vote and deal with cutting up the economic pie. We elect people to go to state offices that have no understanding of why they're there, and certainly not even going to Congress because it's all about money.
But that's why, you know, as I pivot to you, Pastor Hatch, and to you, Dr. LaShawn Latrice, I don't think it's too much to ask Kamala Harris, and yes, Donald Trump, and Jill Stein, and Cornel West, and everybody, what is your plan for the least of these, particularly for Black America and for Indigenous people who index far worse, far beneath where Black people are, Pastor Hatch?
No, no, thank you. It's a great conversation to listen to, and of course, you know, Dr. King, the trajectory of his life, 5 years he would have left to live after giving that speech, that sermon. I have a dream. He's in a radically different place 5 years later. In fact, you know, he tells, I think, Harry Belafonte, I fear that I've integrated my people into a burning house. He began to see the complexities of the system and just how intractable and it would be to radically alter, redistribute the wealth and the power. And you know, sadly, we're in the worst condition today. You know, I thought it was very interesting. I was down at the 16th Street Baptist Church with one of my seminary classes year for I think last year, and we were talking to you know, some of the folks there, and that church was built by a Black congregation, African American congregation, with an African American architect, funded by an African American bank, with the note being paid by the African American congregation. And you know, obviously it was a segregated society, but the truth is that we can't function that way even to this in this season where we actually have that kind of agency, that kind of you know, economic capacity to do for self. And so in many ways it's a worse condition that we're in, and so much of it is you know, a poverty of values as well. You know, when you kind of look at the way people you know, function, the attraction of brand names and you know, things that don't really have value. You know, it's really a real spiritual malaise as well that you know, we're going to have to fight through. But I think that, you know, the pleasure of listening to, I think, Sean Fain, the head of the United Auto Workers, and you know, as a sort of seminary professor, I keyed in. He was in town a few months ago, and I keyed in on him and his social gospel sort of way that he's really operating in that union, and it kind of harkens back to unions being you know, champions of social justice, and of looking at those who are in the margins and knowing that until the margins are brought to the center, that's actually when the kingdom of God arrives, when the folks who are the most marginalized become center in public policy. That's in fact when all lives matter, and we move you know, closer to perfecting the union and beloved community. So it is an incredible vision that Dr. King has, that we get to look back on at this time of year. But clearly, you know, he was not at the height of his prophetic vision in 1963. It really is 1968. when it clearly to him the dream had become a nightmare.
Well, but
Yeah.
people like Reverend James Bevel were pushing, because what people have to understand about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's staff, because my parents came in through the Bevel rebels, and Reverend Bevel was the one who put the kids in the streets in Alabama. He was really the creative genius of the movement, who was way out there, and it was. But what Dr. King did have was that creative tension. You know, Andrew Young was a little bit, a lot more conservative, but very necessary. Reverend White T. Walker, very learned, very ordered. Um, but they were all Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who was not part of the staff. But all of these people, Dorothy Cotton, and on and on and on, they all, after they met and talked about things, they moved in another direction. But the world, the zeitgeist was leading us in that direction, Pastor Hatch. And as Dr. Gibbs' book says, the rich revolted. And I think we have to acknowledge that with all of the progress that we've made, Dr. LaShawn Latrice, because I'd like for you to give us some words before I get some words from everybody to close out. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. These people pushed back, and I think we just have to understand that. Dr. LaShawn Latrice, community psychologist, what say you?
Thank you. Thank you, Santina. Hello, everyone. This is really an interesting discussion. I think we're living in a day now where we see that progress has been made, but not enough progress. When we think about the opposition that's being faced on every hand when it comes to housing, fair jobs, equitable schools, equitable employment, things like that. People really look at the civil rights movement and everything that happened as a catalyst for where we are now. But we also know that there are entities that have aligned themselves with trying to stop progress from happening by infiltrating every which way they can. And the other side of it is without us uniting and collaborating together, even those of us that have differences, I don't think that we'll really make much progress until we realize that we have to strike harder as a unit.
Mm-hmm. Together.
Yep.
Together. I mean, and that really is it. I've got literally a minute for everybody, or just under that, because we've got to run into the next segment. I've been recovering all week, but you know what? Duty calls. My brother needs me, and I'm going to be running. Yes, yes, Ariel. I'm his big sister. and he needs me to run with him a place this evening. But and Dr. King was his godfather, ironically enough. Um, and oh, God bless Dr. King, and God bless Roy Wilkins and Bayard Rustin and John Lewis and all of these people who came together. James Farmer, oh my gosh, and the Divine Nine, the people with PhDs and no Ds, Ariel, they all came together and they dared anyone to break the line. Ariel Gold, about 30 seconds for you. Oh, you're still on mute. Oh, the genius.
One of the things that we've been watching is the Republican Party take on the rhetoric of being for the working class, and hearing what's accurate is they're hearing the pain of the people. They're hearing the massive gap we have between the 1% and the 99%. And what neoliberalism has done to this country. They're hearing the inequality. They have no intention of doing anything about it. But this is an opportunity. And yeah, we saw it with Bernie Sanders, for us to push the Democratic Party to retake that constituency and to do so in a genuine way, because I think we lost it because we just talked about economic equality while continuing to widen the gap.
Pastor Hatch, 30 seconds for you.
No, just piggybacking on Ariel, this is unsustainable. This ever widening gap between the rich and the poor. It's a recipe for for social unrest and instability, and I think we're gonna see more of it. You could trace a lot of this to Citizens United, where this money just flow into politics every election cycle, and literally remove government further and further from the people.
We've seen the mega donors, 50 of them, have put $1.5 billion into this presidential campaign. And I don't care whether it goes to the Democrats or the Republicans, this is wrong. And you ought to stand up against it. This is just wrong. It's just wrong. Dr. LaShawn Latrice, 30 seconds for you. Dr. LaShawn Latrice. Well, you know what I'm going to come. Okay.
I'm sorry.
That's all
I'm
right.
sorry about that, Santita.
It's okay.
I just want to piggyback on what you said. It's going to take everybody to move forward and keep forwarding those things that have taken place in the past. For us to get a more progressive amount of change, it's going to be a unified effort, and we just have to just move forward and lay our differences aside so that we can really impact some real change and not go backwards, but just go forward.
And keep the conversations going. Reverend Dr. Jeanette Wilson, before I close out with you, Attorney Fancher.
I think that we have to focus economically. We need to focus on a Marshall Plan for Black and poor people. We have to have a Marshall Plan to re-energize and restart groups. And it's not based on education. It's not based on anything other than God has called this country to do right by our people. And we must unitedly, as a union, say that with conviction. Challenge these corporations, public and private, that we do business with, to do business fairly with us.
And then make them do it. Attorney Mark Fancher, the last 30 seconds belong to you.
Yeah, when the French and when the United States went to Niger and they threatened them and said that you will return this neo-colonial puppet dictator that you threw out to his position of leadership in Niger, you will do it. They stood up and said, we will not. And then they said, we will come and get you. And when they said that, Mali and Burkina Faso stood up beside them and said, if you deal with Niger, you're going to have to deal with us. And they said, not only will you not attack Niger, you're going to get your troops and you're going to get out of Africa right now, at least out of the Sahel region. 3 countries did that. If we can get 54 African countries to stand together like that and to threaten the empire and to say, listen, not only are you going to treat Africa well, but you're going to treat Africa's children in the United States, in Brazil, in England, in France, you're going to all treat them well. And if you don't treat them well, you're going to have to deal with us. All of this coltan, all of this uranium, all of the oil, all the gold, all the silver, everything that you've been plundering Africa for generations is no longer yours. You either do right by them or you will get crushed. That's when we will have liberation. And so in terms of being smart about how we use our time and our political energy, that's how we should focus it, as opposed to just focusing so much on candidates in the United States.
Everybody, it's still a dream, but you know what? We have the power to make all of this real. We don't have 500 years. We cannot wait. Why we cannot wait? Because we just cannot. We cannot wait 500 years for Black people and Indigenous people and those who've been locked out in the damned and the dispossessed. We cannot wait that long for people to achieve equality in America. That is not God's way. And if we're not going to do it God's way, as my grandma Gertrude said, then it won't be done at all. How about that? How about you? How do you like them apples, Ariel Gold, Pastor Hatch? I'd bring up some of that old wisdom. Absolutely. Reverend Dr. Jeanette Wilson, Attorney Mark Fancher. That's right. Put that fist in there. Dr. LaShawn Latrice. More of this talk on the 61st anniversary of the March on Washington. It was about much more than Dr. King having a dream. He said, America, you have defaulted on your promise. You bounced a check on America. You've bounced a check on Negro people and therefore on everybody. And we're here to collect. Let's talk about it in the second hour with the author, one of the authors of the study, Still a Dream, that illustrates point by point how it is that we lost, how it is that it's going to take 500 years at the current rate for us to achieve equality. Think about it, everybody. See you in a few minutes on the Santita Jackson Show. Like and share the show, everybody. Like and share the show. And let's get on over to the second hour.